right. Hello, everyone. Guess we're ready to jump right in.
I know, I'm ready to cry. Thank you all for coming.
Yeah. Yeah. No, and my name's John Hendel. I'm with Politico, and have been hearing about this book for, I feel, years. And excited to talk through
Lift up your mic
all the different elements of that. And so wanted to start a little bit with the title, too, Digitally Invisible. Wanted to ask what that means to you and what people should be taking away from that. You know, how did you come to that, and what's the real significance there, Nicole?
Well, first and foremost, can we give John a hand? This has been my friend for years here in D.C. And I appreciate him for doing this. So first, I want to just say thank you all for coming. This has been a long time coming, the book and this launch. If some of you remember, the book actually released in August, but everybody was away on vacation. And so our DC tour officially starts today, and we'll talk more about places that we're going to show up across the country. And it's so good to see so many familiar faces here. I am so humbled by your support today, and for those of you who are watching online, you know, I'm humbled for that support because it's been a long journey. You know, how did the book get to be digitally invisible? She's beautiful, right? In terms of the cover. You know, it started because a young black girl from New Rochelle, New York, decided to go to Chicago and get into technology. And back in the 90s, when I actually started, so if all of you have been reading the book and you've been trying to calculate my age, I am old. I have a birthday tomorrow, too. But I've been doing this for quite some time. And I was this young woman, you know, again, a young black girl in New Rochelle, New York, that had discovered computers, wasn't a computer scientist, but I discovered a community in Chicago, which I write about in the book, that I didn't know about. One, they were people I had not met, because if you come from a family like mine where your mother has 15 brothers and sisters and you go to a place like Chicago and you have no cousins, you find family. And so I found family in this 380 square foot computer lab. And from there I realized just how disconnected people were compared to what I was experiencing in college. So here I was in technology, didn't know anything about it, except that I loved the people that embraced me when I went in there to volunteer. You know, again, this young girl who knew nothing about technology, was a grad student in Chicago doing sociology, and here I was wiring computers and upgrading RAM. I'm going to date myself. Anybody remember the 386 computer? That was the computer I was upgrading with a lot of RAM. Anybody remember the Microsoft Encarta CD? Anybody remember when you plugged in your computer, it went, eek, you got mail. So the title came because those people were invisible like myself, because we didn't know what technology was going to actually bring us. And when I was thinking about a title, there were two influences. One, a gentleman by the name of Richard Reeves, who is a scholar here and now runs his institute. I think I was at a Christmas party in this very room telling him about the book, and I told him it's about the digital divide. He said, hey, that's boring. You need something else. And then I went into my head to think about, who is this about? And it's about people who are not seen. And if you remember in the book, it's also about this book that inspired me as a young person, Ralph Ellison's Invisible Man, where he talks so much about people wanting to be seen so much that at some point he fell into a bunker during a race riot and nobody actually knew he was gone. And so I have felt like that at moments in my career of being invisible as a woman in tech. And I know that there are so many people who felt like that back in the 90s. And as I matured and have matured in this space, I realized before the pandemic, there were people who felt like that. And many of those people you're going to meet today who no one spoke to them or talked to them about their experiences being connected to the internet. And so for many of us in this room who have worked on this for decades, it was a way of my actually having a slogan to show that we're not invisible people. And so that's where the title came, and that's where all these beautiful people came, thanks to our staff here at Brookings. I had this idea, and if you look closely, you can actually see the souls of the people on the front of this cover, because they want to be seen, because they've not been seen for so long.
It's also a big moment for all of the topics that you talk about here.
I know, perfect timing.
Whether it's broadband, you know, the digital divide, connectivity issues, and a lot of that has to do with the pandemic. And I wanted to ask a little bit about how that influenced the timeline in putting this together, because you'd been working on this before the pandemic too. How did that play a role for you when trying to kind of grapple with these issues? Because you've been working on this for years. These have been big issues for years, predating the pandemic. But then to have, a global, shutdown essentially happening for many months in there, that did change the conversation a little bit. And we've seen different investments happening as a result of that too. What did that mean for you as a writer, as a researcher, as someone looking into these issues when you were figuring out how to pull it all into one piece?
Well, I love that question. So I often tell people, prior to the pandemic, I felt like I did in high school, like I didn't have a date, right? And so I felt like the girl did have a date that nobody wanted to dance with. Post-pandemic, it was all about the partying, baby, right? And it was like, Nicole, come tell us about the digital divide. Talk about the digital divide. We had a digital divide before the pandemic. There's a huge movement of people, many in this room, who've been working on community technology issues. That's where I started in technology. But it wasn't until the pandemic hit, John, to your point, where the book matured. And so you're going to hear from my dear friend, Dr. Trimble. I met her 2 or 3 weeks before the pandemic hit. If I tell you, and I have photos to prove it, these kids had, their technology on their arm, their phone in their hand, and they were high-fiving her on the way out of school. This is in a black rural community in Marion, Alabama, the birthplace of Coretta Scott King, as a matter of fact. And so I had gone around the country, because part of what I wanted to do as a sociologist was to get at the indigenous experiences of people. So just for people who are interested, if I might add, I went to farming rural communities where I met Barry and Chris, who we know who lives in D.C. I did not know he lived in a rural community and was commuting back and forth. So I went to Staunton, Virginia. I found myself in rural Alabama, Phoenix, Arizona. I was in Syracuse, New York. Wherever people would take me, I would go. And I would spend a lot of time just talking to people on the street. For a minute, I think I was with Chris, and somebody thought I was a caseworker or the police. And I had to tell them, I just want to know about your internet access. That's all I want to know, right? But before the pandemic, we heard the stories about young people sitting on the stoops of the retail stores and McDonald's. That was not new before the pandemic. There were kids that were already doing that. Dr. Trimble's kids were living in rural Marion, Alabama, and they weren't able to use many of the technologies that they had in school. And oftentimes, they would sit on the front of her school themselves on weekends just to do their homework. So for me, when the pandemic hit, I had to keep going. I wanted to stop. If you've ever written a book, you want to give it an end, right? Because at some point, your publisher, your editor is saying, stop, write it in the next book. But I had to keep going because I knew that there was something different about the pandemic that would affect the people that I met. And I remember calling Kathy, and I said, how are things going there? And she wrote me an email. She said, not so well. Those technology, those tablets those kids had, they're like books without paper. Hopefully she'll share that with you. There were people I couldn't find that I had spoken to, businesses that were no longer operating. And so for me, it became personal, right? Somebody who's been doing this for, since the 90s, knowing that this had existed, now getting the attention, it became for me, keep going on this book until we can at least get to a state where we can explain it. Now, it was tough, because I had to stop the book because we're going into an election. I am trying to actually write a book during a national election as well. But it turned out to be the best timing because I think, to your point, the issues are so alert and aware right now. And these are issues, as you've noticed, and I've talked about it, John, with you before the book, this is about digital competitiveness. At the end of the day, it's not about giving people more shiny objects and computers. It's about making sure that we have a workforce, we have students, we have communities, we have a country that really invests in this digital technology of tomorrow, because the train has left the station and we've already leapfrogged into AI.
No, and it's so interesting because, you do travel to all of these different locations. You had your broadband tour, essentially.
I know, I called it the Digital Divide Tour, right? So, I had an Instagram for that, and then I couldn't keep up with it.
No, it's a lot. And
it's a lot.
It's interesting because you take that and then you put it in the context of a lot of the bigger history around, how these policies have come up, weaving in different personal detail, weaving in some of the travels and all those different pieces. And so, I couldn't put it down for that reason. I thought it was really interesting. And one of the most interesting things when thinking through the history of these issues too was thinking about how different administrations in the past tried to articulate and think about and begin to discover different pieces of these debates, and wanted to reflect back a little bit on that history. When you think about the last 20, 30, 40 years, what were some of the early challenges, do you think, in policymakers first kind of coming onto the scene on these issues?
Yeah, it's so interesting, and I had the chance to live out many of these issues, right? I was around when President Clinton actually put money into what was called the first neighborhood network. I was in the affordable housing complex at the Northwest Tower Apartments, 300 square feet, Microsoft Encarta, 386 computers, and then President Clinton became the digital divide president. Out of nowhere, he blessed Vice President Gore to come in and help us fix those issues. That program provided funding to affordable housing. That was so incredible for many of those neighborhood networks that were actually appearing all throughout the country. Different administrations had some political will, as you're suggesting, to do this. I've actually watched from Clinton all the way to the people who came after him up until recently. And so for me, it also became a challenge because in every administration, there was always a rollback based on who was elected. And so I kept trying to think in my mind, this is a universal issue, right? Having kids sit in Taco Bell and McDonald's is just not acceptable, but yet, under President Obama, for example, we had the Connect Ed initiative that had a goal of 97% of students and schools and libraries connected, but yet it was rolled back. And so that became a poignant issue for me because having been a person who is actually part of living history, I often tell students who ask me, well, how did you get here? I tell them I got here by paying attention and wanting to know what side of history I wanted to be on. Did I want to be on the one that told the past, or do I want to be one in the future? But I also wanted to acknowledge, just like writers like James Baldwin and others have said, that you've got to come to grips with what the reality is. And so I think what you're talking about, and someone just asked me about this the other day. They asked me, did you make up that term race, place, and space and the intersection with technology? And I said, no. It dawned on me by meeting people in public housing that those are spaces where people are looking to be connected. It dawned on me going to very rural areas where there are actually more cows than people. I kid you not, I had this story, Barry will tell you. I was so scared when I went down to some of the rural areas, not because of just all the history, but because there were a lot of cows and there were no stop signs and I could not use my navigation services, right? I think there was one point that I just turned into a cow and it was just me and him. It was fascinating to me because I'm from New York. I live in Washington, D.C. I'm in Alexandria, right? But I did not realize just 2 hours away from D.C., the extent to which it was so rural. I mean, when I went to Marion, Alabama, it took me 2 hours from Birmingham, and all I kept seeing were get free internet, get reduced internet. And going back to what you said, we've been talking about this issue. I mean, President Biden has basically said he is going to finish the job. Well, we're now in a national election. Are we really going to finish the job? Because we still have the same challenges. I was just with educators who are trying to figure out how do we continue laptops when there's no more pandemic relief funding? Mm-hmm. How do we make sure that we have updated technology in the workplace when now, we're basically telling people, come back to work. So all the things that we advance, we're basically retreating on those messages. So for me, it's like, my daughter, she's in Fairfax County. They got to put away their cell phones. For me, we've had this love-hate relationship with technology, but at the same time, we've benefited in so many ways because it is our new advanced manufacturing. It is our new industrial revolution. And so that's what you sense in the book, right? These issues are overlaid on top of things like housing segregation and discrimination. They overlay on educational disparities. They overlay on health disparities. I was at a library, if I could tell you. I'm a storyteller. I have to tell the story. I was in Phoenix, and I was visiting a Latino school, and all the kids had cell phones. I couldn't understand why they all had cell phones. And one of the teachers said, and the principal said, well, they have cell phones, but not to use it in the classroom and for schoolwork. They use it in case they get a call because a parent has been deported illegally, or they need to stay in contact with a family member. I left that school, went a couple miles to look at the local library, saw a woman basically crying to get a library card. This is all in the same visit. Why is this woman crying to get a library card? Now, because I told you, I was kind of like Kamau Bell, I think, from CNN. I was like, excuse me, my name is Nicol. I'm from D.C. You don't know me, but I heard you screaming for a library card. Well, it turned out she needed a library card because she was just diagnosed with stage 4 breast cancer. And she was going to the public library to check on her records. To me, that was a flashback of when I started in this space. And so part of the energy about where you're talking about is we actually know how to do this, folks, right? We have one of the most advanced technological innovation across the world. We have many of our companies that are advancing and pushing that narratives. We have civil society that understands the significance of making sure that our kids have 21st century skills. We don't train them on the typewriter anymore like I was trained, right? We train them on computers. But yet we have invisible people across this country that are trying to find ways to participate in this new economy. And so that's why I really wanted to take the time. My 82-year-old aunt was like, okay, you're going to put all that stuff in the book? I just want to read a general book. I said, no, I got to get that in there so other people will read it, right? I had to go through some history for us to land in a space of shared vision and goal. Because at the end of the day, I don't think there was much polarization as to whether or not people needed to get online to do basic tasks.
Well, and you do weave it together
Yes.
with all of these different travels around, often very easy to picture kind of Nicol in the middle of.
I know, I wish I had a camera. Anybody listening out there? It was so wonderful.
That really jumped out reading it, though.
Yeah.
I mean, I really could sense you out there, and you also brought in, those times from, your own life that you mentioned, in Chicago, in the computer lab settings there, leading that as the.
I was the computer lady.
Yes, yes, and just to quickly reflect on that, I mean, that was right in those Clinton years when folks were first starting to think about internet connectivity and digital access. Why did you begin there, and what did you take away from that part of your life when thinking about these things years later?
Well, I love the way John, he clearly read the book. Can we give John a hand because he got through it, right? Because some people haven't fully read the book yet. When I went to Syracuse and I met Deborah, that's when I went back and told my story. Because, when you're an author, for folks who have written a book, it's not a linear process, right? You start and you think this is a really good idea, and then you're like, oh, I gotta take that out. And then you want to put something else in, and you're like, well, that doesn't fit. It's almost like if you went into my house or in my office, you would just see Post-it notes, right? Mark McCarthy, just everywhere trying to piece together the story. So I went back to myself after going to Syracuse and meeting Deborah. Deborah was in a senior-assisted affordable housing complex. She invited me in. They had invited me in. I had heard the spiel, and they took me into a 300-square-foot computer lab. So as I told you in the beginning, that's how I started. 386 computers, pretty much. She was like, these are the computers we got donated. Here's that one printer. And I looked at Deborah, and I saw myself. And I said, shame on us, right? Because I'm reincarnated 30 years later in this computer lab. So I had to go back and tell people, I've been here before, right? I was Nicol, who showed up after meeting this guy in a parking lot who later became my friend, who's like, come volunteer at my computer lab. And I walked in and looked like a utility closet, right? Computers didn't work, but there were all of these energetic, friendly people that wanted to get online. And just for a fact, this was right around the time of 9/11, where, I don't know, many of you remember this, there was like this shrinking of classified newspaper employment ads. So your big newspaper was now monster.com and career.com. And so people in this building needed to go online, do a resume, and apply. Well, Deborah told me she had to do the same thing. This time it was for 65-plus people. She said, oh, so people come in here, they do their email. When they do their email, I help them get their benefits. Sometimes they want to write something for their grandkids. So here I am in 2018, 2019, looking at Deborah. But Deborah had a different story. She had this big window in her computer lab, and she kept looking out this window. And I'm like, why do you keep looking out this window? She said, well, one day, you see that highway right there? It's going to be gone, and they're going to take away this building, and pretty soon it's going to be gentrified. So I'm just worried about my lab and what's going to happen in my lab. And that's why I look out this window every day. And I said to myself, wait, these issues are much bigger. See, in Washington, we have conversations on technology as if it doesn't exist in a context. Right? And back then, under the Clinton years, it was just technology for technology's sake, right? President Clinton was just giving housing developments computers, giving us AmeriCorps volunteers. We didn't understand this connection of where we were going to be with the internet. But Deborah, she knew not just where the internet was going to take her, but where her community was going to go. And that's why it was important for me to kind of weave back in these messages, these unsettled areas that we as technologists may think, well, it's all about the technology. Well, we're not giving credit to the fact that it's not just the technology. I mean, there are companies I found, and I write about this, we got to give them their fair shake. The internet did not break during the pandemic, right? People still stayed connected. We had low-cost programs. I had to rewrite the book about 3 times because of the Affordable Connectivity Program was in the first version. I had to take it out, put it back in, take it out, put it back in. I told the publisher, can you hold on 1 second? I want to see if Congress is going to do something to save this program. But we had these tools in place. The challenge of the digitally invisible is that they live in spaces and places, elder people, you know, the Deborahs of the world, where we've written them off already. Technology is just a complication and another social determinant of their well-being. And I want people to kind of get that message, right? When we're talking about race, place, and space, why didn't we during the pandemic? And John, I'll ask you this, because I was trying to figure it out. I meant to ask President Biden and Vice President Harris. I'll ask her when she gets in office. Why didn't we wire up public housing? 53 million school kids went home during the pandemic. I think of 1.4 million people in this country live in affordable housing, but we never wired up the spaces in which they lived.
Well, and I think that brings me to like another big question I did have for you too, which is how we're actually doing now. I mean, fast forwarding, 20 years from, when you were first in the computer labs there, when you were seeing all of those different technology issues up close. We have had the pandemic and we've seen massive investments in recent years on this. There is a lot happening that I'm sure many people in the room are familiar with, $65 billion for broadband and the infrastructure law, other bigger investments moving forward. Is that enough to complete the job, if that can even be said? Like, how do you think about that in some of these contexts now, about this current moment? You also mentioned this is kind of an election year book coming out at this big moment, final few months with President Biden in office, and he has, shepherded a lot of different efforts on this. How is the government doing?
I think the government has a fantastic opportunity to change this. I mean, we have seen government investment over the years through the American Recovery Act. If you all remember, we had money towards internet access. We had the biggest investment under the Biden-Harris administration. Our challenge is, and I'm pretty, specific about this, is that we might be doing the same thing over and over again in terms of what we're funding. So we keep overfunding rural, underfunding urban, as opposed to thinking about urban solutions versus rural solutions, and they're not necessarily competing in interest, right? I think that we tend to fund infrastructure more broadly when maybe we should be looking at funding healthcare. I mean, most companies in this country today are tech companies. Why don't we have other participants who are giving towards universal service so that it's just not, a small, I don't know if some of you remember, universal service was created under Ronald Reagan to essentially be a way to provide help towards 911 and emergency communication services. That's actually expanded its bandwidth. But we should be thinking about broadening who participates in serving the invisible populations that we have. I mean, for me, I do have a blueprint in here. I'm hoping that a couple of people will get their hands on this book. I mean, there are some things that we could actually do, like creating more digital service corps for people to go into their communities. I mean, we saw in the pandemic, for example, people being told to schedule their vaccinations online and not having connectivity or not knowing how to do this. Why don't we have a portion of our Corporation for National Service where people actually do that? I mean, I think we can get close, but I do think we have to recognize as policymakers that this is not the same digital divide. I call it this is not your grandmother's digital divide, right? This is a different technological revolution that is going to beg us to just be much more flexible in our thinking and to not drive ourselves by policy, but by people and community. And I do think if we were to look at it that way, we'd have so many more people coming to the table. I was just yesterday in California talking to CIOs about the book. And the CIO said, well, what are we supposed to do? I was like, you're in charge, right? You want to hire people to come and work in your companies, but you can't do that if there are young kids that live in the neighborhoods in which you are actually have your footprint and they have no idea on how to use digital technology. We need those kinds of corporate investments. And we need to recognize, my dear friend John Winhausen there, that schools and libraries did as much work as the government to keep people connected, but yet we do have the digital equity grant that's out there, but it's a small portion of the funding to actually keep this train running. And so I think, we should get radical, right? I've been doing this, so now I can say this. I never thought I could ever say this. With my birthday coming, I'll say, when you get over a certain age, you get to say things that you couldn't say when you were younger. I think we should be radically thinking about how to re-engineer digital technology and this digital inclusion and equity debate as one that is integrated into every fabric of our economy. It's part of our criminal justice reform. It's part of our healthcare reform. It's part of education. What that means, it doesn't become programmatic. And I think for many of us that are sitting in this room, we love programs, but we know programs are temporal based on who's in office. So let's do something different.
No, it's so interesting because you also, there have been many steps forward in the last couple years and, $42 billion for kind of a bigger broadband program, money for digital equity grants, things in that space. But, you touched on the Affordable Connectivity Program.
Right.
This is a huge program that was also created in the infrastructure law, helped 23 million households in the U.S. pay for their monthly broadband bills. And this went away in the middle of this year. That's been a source of great debate about whether to bring it back. There was a lot of debate on Capitol Hill about whether to keep it funded at the time. You were talking about, struggling to know when to finish the book based on that too.
Like, come back.
Is a part of the struggle that I immediately wondered about when thinking about, putting together a big look like this.
That's right.
With something like that going away, how much does that create a challenge for the next administration? How much does affordability play a role on some of these issues too? I feel like that's been
it's a big
source
issue.
of great attention recently in a way we didn't really always see in the past.
That's right.
And wanted to really dwell on that specifically a little bit.
Well, I think having access to the funds to have the service is important. Look, the economy is a big issue in this election, and partly because people are deciding what do they pay for next and still have money in their pocket. We don't want people to decide between getting broadband service and bread. Let me say that again. And I know I might sound like a preacher, but that's okay, because if you're here, you want to hear the preacher and you want to hear the message. People should not have to decide between broadband and bread. There were so many people that I met on the ground that were negotiating through whether or not they could keep their phone on, whether or not they could pay this monthly service. That should just not be negotiable, because we know when these kids are not online, we lose. We know when people live in spaces where they don't have the opportunity to work remote, they lose. We don't know if we'll ever have another pandemic and people have to actually retreat to their quarters. They will not have an option. We'll have the same thing happen again. So I think, we made a big mistake by not actually continuing the Affordable Connectivity Program. And, there's a lot of research that says, well, cost matters, but it's not the biggest thing. You got to have infrastructure. It's a supply and demand issue, folks. If we're going to build the supply, we got to have people who can meet the demand. And that means they've got to be able to tap into these networks so they're successful. Unfortunately, I've been around long enough, John. I was here when the municipal broadband effort went and where we were trying to actually create and carve out spaces where government could be a provider. But we also saw at that time many of those models not sustainable because we didn't have the consumer base. It's really a balancing act. And I think for people getting online, I don't want to see any more Francis's yelling at the librarian, crying for a library card to check a medical record so she could actually communicate back to her doctor. I don't want to see any more Joseph from Staunton, Virginia, who's a day laborer who cannot work simply because he doesn't have access because, he decided to watch a couple of movies, and now we're blaming him and saying, well, he should have known where he wanted to put his minutes. That's not our business, right? I don't think the same way that we're talking about many of our political issues on the table today, that we should be making how people use and what they spend their money on our personal issue. We want them to have the flexibility like the Affordable Connectivity Program. The first time in my life where people could go into a provider and say, I have my money. What can I get for this to make sure my kids are connected? And then I want to say, on top of that, we have to acknowledge that the internet is not just about the connectivity part of it, right? In terms of the hard connectivity. I call it the soft connectivity. What people do online is what they do online. And I encountered so many wonderful people that were doing things that I couldn't even imagine that I would do, right? They were, I have this, I don't know if it got into the book or not, but I had met this woman who, it was a beauty shop owner and a barbershop owner. They fought me tooth and nail. One guy from Cleveland, another lady from West Hartford. I'm not getting on that internet. I don't need that internet. No internet. And I was like, well, how do your customers pay? They were like, oh, Cash App. I said, well, you on the internet, right? They're like, oh, that's the internet? I said, yes, that's the internet, honey. They're like, when people are paying, are they paying cash? No, they doing that thing. You know, they take out their phone and then they scan this QR code, and that's how they pay. My point is, like, people don't know what they don't have, and that's what for me, the consequence of not finishing up ACP and making it part of our DNA is that people didn't know what they didn't have. Can I just go on this one last story?
Of course, yeah.
I was in China. It's a true story. Like, so as a result of my colleagues here, I got an opportunity to go to the World Internet Conference several years. And every time I would go, of course, you all know me. If you don't know, you know me now. I'd break off from the group for a minute and I'd walk around the small water town. So I decided the first year I was going to walk away and just go around and see what was in this town. Now, I'm not going to lie. They thought I was Michelle Obama the first time because my hair was straight. That is my Michelle Obama moment, okay? I've had two of them. I lived in Chicago, so I once had somebody think I was her, but I told them I was too short. And the second time, I was in this small water town, and everybody was looking at me, and I heard somebody say, Michelle Obama. I said, no, that's not me, honey. True story. So if you ever go to China, they are fascinated by brown skin, right? And people who just look different. So I'm walking around this water town like I'm nobody's business, like I'm supposed to be walking around. People were friendly, and I found my way to this marketplace underneath this bridge. And I meet this woman because she had these beautiful cashmere scarves. She was 88, and I want to buy these scarves. And I'm looking at her, I'm saying, can I buy these scarves? And she says, no English. So we're just trying to figure out. She pulls out a smartphone with a QR code in the middle of this water town in 2020. It was like 2019, 2017, sometime around there. And I didn't know what to say. I'm like, she has a QR code. I had cash. She had a QR code. She was in her 80s. It dawned on me again, like, we're missing something here, right? We're missing something. Not to say that, you know, the Chinese government in all respects is doing everything right, but every time I saw that woman, because I actually got to meet her grandkids, her sister, every year I would go see her, as a matter of fact. I have photos of that maturation for the next 5 years. Whenever I came, she knew I was coming. The whole marketplace knew I was coming. They go, she's here. I think they knew I had money to spend, too, so they would pull me into their cubby and say, what about my scarves? But it dawned on me when I was actually doing that visit and just walking around, like, why aren't we there? Mm-hmm. You know, like, what is it about us that is so different that we're not there? We've got people who are unbanked. You know what I mean? We have opportunities for businesses and entrepreneurs. But for me, like, again, this is a global issue that we're not tackling and we're not getting into. Well, now, I lost my train of thought because I needed to tell that story. So
no, and I think that was a good segue into, I think, what might be my last question here, because we're probably going to turn to any questions from the audience in a moment. So start thinking if there's anything you might want to ask. But that, I think, raises a good question for me, which is how we think about these issues now, and what language we use. You've questioned whether comparing things to the New Deal makes sense, or rural electrification. I mean, that's a common refrain we've heard a lot for the last several years. You know, you've seen President Biden, even at the DNC, comparing broadband expansion to rural electrification. But, you know, you've had some interesting kind of reactions to that. I'm curious if you talk about the language and how you think about that and what the concepts are really at play there, while folks think of any questions they might have.
Oh my goodness, John, you hit it. So, like, I also wanted to do in the book, like, this language thing, right? I wanted us to challenge our language. You know, for somebody who wrote a first book, like, I did some really cool stuff in there that I didn't really know I was doing, right? Thank you, Amber and Tara West, for editing. So he's so right. So as I'm writing the book, I didn't want to use digital divide, right? Because that is a notion we've used, a vernacular we've used for 30 years. Larry Irving is the king of the term. He blurbed the book. But we talked about the digital divide when I was in this space in the 90s. That's why I wanted to use digitally invisible. We talk about the New Deal. Well, I was interviewing Representative Clyburn on a podcast, and I kept saying, this is the New Deal. This is the New Deal. And he turned around, he said to me, honey, I don't want you to use that word no more because it really wasn't a New Deal for Black Americans. I had written all this stuff. Some of you might follow my stuff, Tech New Deal, New Deal, New Deal, New Deal. And he said, you know, that language was not always inclusive, that it wasn't a New Deal at that time. So then I challenged my own understanding of language. Rural electrification was interesting because after I went to visit Garrett County, I went to go see Chris. And Chris was part of like this founding of LGBT tech in rural Virginia. And if you know anything about rural Virginia, there's a lot of folks that are not just coming out and telling their parents I'm gay. And so I was like, wait a minute, rural is not just white and straight. Rural electrification didn't really give electrification to everybody in this country. So I challenged the ways in which I actually approach these in my own paradigms to, again, help us think more radically about how we look at this issue. It dawned on me, John, like as I was writing the book and as I've spoken about it for 30 years, I'm using the same language that I used 30 years ago. That's why looking at Deborah was poignant for me, because what it suggested is we keep treating this issue the same way. And so the moral of the book is like, let's do something different, right? This is not a book that is all about sadness. That's why I think the aspirations of people and their goals was equally important for me to share, and it was equally humbling for them to come today, because I didn't make this stuff up. But at the same token, I didn't see them as people who didn't have the charisma and motivation and energy to get this done. I could say this real quick. There's so many of us in this room have done this before. Deborah, I see you. There's so many of us who have worked in this space. Devin, I see you. Matthew, I seen you. We were all invisible. I'm here to make us all visible, y'all, so that people see that this work that we're doing, it's part of the bigger picture of where we want our society to be. So sorry to call you out, but that's where this book came from, because there's so many champions.
And you can really see, you interrogating a lot of those different concepts and thinking through that in the pages of that. And with that, would want to turn to any questions we might have in the room here. If anyone, wants to raise their hand, if so, and I think there's folks with microphones that'll be able to come around. If so, I think we have a question here.
Thank you, John, for stopping me. I almost went to tears because it's so emotional, personal. So thank you for stopping me, because I want to keep my makeup good for me.
Hello, how are you? I've done research also in technology and communication, and I was wondering in terms of stopping this... in terms of stopping this digital divide, how much does the private sector play a role? Because a lot of these big mobile companies play a huge role in the pricing and accessibility of internet access to both urban and rural communities equally. And oftentimes, I think with completely subsidizing internet access, the private sector is a big barrier in a lot of ways to actually making this occur in a long-term manner. So what do you think the government or people in lobbying circles can do to kind of solve this kind of dilemma?
Well, I love that question, because I think I try to bring that out in the book, which is everybody has a role to play in this, whether in the creation of where we are with the digital divide and then how we're going to solve it. So your question is one that is particularly poignant, right? Because if you match, and I talk about this in the book, the policy making that we've done here in DC, it has been focused on sort of removing gatekeepers, right? And really getting down to, well, how do we actually bring access to these communities if telecoms are setting the prices, or, these companies are saying this? Well, what I found out in the book is it's a mix of a lot of different factors, right? Whereas it was been easier for me to point a finger, it's hard for me to think through what does access look like in terms of things like digital discrimination, when people like Deborah already live discriminated against, right? They already live in housing projects where people are not even considering them, not just for internet, but for clean water. And so I had to challenge myself, too, to think about, is this a book about blame, or is it a book about here's the reality and here's the things that we need to do? Now, to your point, what that suggests is that we've had some policies, John and I know, that have gone on for many, many decades that tend to still fall in the same space. Who is the gatekeeper? How do we remove them? My suggestion in the book is that perhaps there are ways in which we can re-envision how we actually tackle policy to be much more relevant to things. So I'll tell you one thing I did that I know some people are not going to be happy with me about, but it was something I thought would be helpful for the people I met. So, I suggest that we do zero rating. What does that mean? I suggest that the same way that we're able to offset minutes for people to get online for streaming entertainment, they should be able to go online and have some minutes allocated to find a job, apply for .gov, benefits, et cetera, because there were too many people that I met that did not have the data to be able to do so. Now, to your point, there is some part of it that we could say that we need to change the data cap structure. But there's also a part of it that we need to recognize that technology has changed, and we can also do this because we couldn't do it 20 years ago because we know where people are going based on their IPs. But if we stay with the same policies, we'll never have that breakthrough. And that was sort of what I wanted to get at with the book. It's like, this is a conversation about breakthroughs. If we think about universal service, I know there were going to be some people mad at me at that. It has been the cable companies actually providing that to telephone companies, but I don't know how many people know there's probably about 4 or 5 telephone companies left, and we have new companies like our social media companies, our content creation companies that don't pay into universal service. So maybe we need to have a conversation about that. What I tried to do in the book, and John and I have been hanging on this side for a long time, is to get us to rethink the ways in which we start these conversations and where we want to end up. So to your point, I try not to say it was this person's fault over this person's fault. I'll be honest. I try to say there is a conglomerate of circumstances that have led us to err on the side of certain winners and losers, but the only losers are the people in these communities as we're fighting these debates. And I'm pretty clear about that. Only people losing are people over here. And so I'm hoping that the book will at least inspire further discussion so that we can get closer to our constituents and our people on the ground.
Well, and let's see if we can get another couple questions in here before we have to switch over.
And I'll be a little briefer.
Over here.
But great question.
We can, in 1 second, right after her, we'll turn to you. Yeah.
Hi, thank you so much for speaking with us today. I really appreciate it. I had a question about academic Kiara Bridges talks a lot about how those who need social services oftentimes give up their privacy rights and agree to, well, not agree, but acquiesce to increase surveillance to access those. So my question is, how do we get more people to participate in digital infrastructure without making them give up their data and digital privacy rights?
Well, I think I love that question, too, because it goes back to the earlier one, right? I write in the book that privacy is a concern of the universal service and access to broadband. But when we started these debates, we weren't talking about privacy. So we've segmented these issues, and we've allowed these issues to live in their own silos, of which I'm trying to present ourselves to say they're actually related to create an ecosystem in which tech can thrive. And to your point, these folks are giving up something every day just to participate in society. The surveillance economy is real. We just started an AI equity lab here at Brookings to ensure that we promote non-discriminatory anti-racist AI that doesn't disempower and disenfranchise people. I don't think they're two separate debates, but I do think we've got to solve this issue and start with these fundamental rights before we start bringing more technologies in to widen the gap that we have. So I do think, to answer your question, they're not separate, and I'm really clear in the book. Like, we should be talking about privacy as we talk about universal service because they are complementary.
And I think we have another question over here in the front.
Yes. Hi, thank you so much for shedding light on such an interesting issue. Something you talked about that really spoke to me was talking about the kids that would stay after school, go to a fast food restaurant to do their homework. I mean, that was very similar to my experience in high school. I remember a lot of friends who didn't have internet access, and I was actually in high school as they brought in iPads, brought in more technology. But you also mentioned your daughter goes to school locally and they tell her to put her phone away. I remember when I was in school, a lot of that technology got beat up and broken within a couple of years. And then in my further education, I met people who went to Waldorf schools or who had alternatives to relying on technology. So I'm just curious as to what you think the future of technology's role in the classroom is, ideally to make it so that everyone can take advantage of it to its full extent.
Well, I love that question too. I mean, and technology, as you've said, it's got a privileged component to it, which, I write in the book how in the pandemic, my kids were fine. I was upstairs in my room working. Each of them had their own room and they were remotely accessing the technology. Meanwhile, kids, particularly those in low-income households, were actually the parent in many instances. And we lost a lot of people who did not show on the school roster simply because they were helping their younger siblings get online. I mean, to your point, I think technology, one thing we have to realize, folks, technology is getting cheaper. It's becoming more affordable. In the ed tech space, with regards to the acquisition of supplies of technology, we're going to see that. But one of the things that we need to acknowledge, too, is that during the pandemic was probably the first time we saw more democratized technology. And now we're out of the pandemic. And there are still a lot of schools that are trying to determine, and I'm sure Dr. Kathy can talk about this, do we get those laptops back, or do we figure out ways to actually increase our food consumption, or do we put it in mental health? Schools should not be in the position to actually question the very basic elements that kids need to learn. We shouldn't have kids trying to figure out, a laptop is a textbook, folks. It is a pencil. It is the basic fundamental aspect of what kids need to learn. What we should be focusing on is, should we be putting AI in the classroom? Should we be surveilling kids, right? Should we be having scenarios where, our children's privacy is not safe? I just want us to solve this basic question of just making sure that we get digital equity to everyone. And I think we can do it. To close out on this, I really think we can do it. We have enough money to do it. I just think we have to change the priorities and what we're focusing on to be able to do it.
And I think with that very hopeful, good note,
I'm so hopeful,
is a
John.
good occasion to transition to our panel here of folks who you have spoken to, are in the book, and to continue that conversation, which will be in a couple minutes on the stage here. And for folks with questions, you'll still be here.
Yeah, I'll be here. Look, I didn't want to be selfish with my time. I'm so sorry for people. I'm going to be here. But I could not let this moment of this first DC book launch go without you meeting the people in the book. So I'm here. I'll be around. But thank you, John.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody.
The next panel will be up in a couple moments. So thank you all.
Welcome. Thank you for staying. This is John Windhausen. I run the Schools, Health, and Libraries Broadband Coalition, or Shelby Coalition. It's a great pleasure to be here. Nicol, what a great storyteller you are. I have to say, this is going to be so wonderful to have these panelists, these real stars of your book, on the stage with me. But I have to say, I don't think I've met anybody who creates a message that's both so depressing and so energizing at the same time. My gosh, you're right. We've been working on this for 30 years to try to solve the digital divide, and here we are still talking about it because it hasn't been done. And your awareness and your publicity, bringing to light the needs of people and making them visible is such an important message. And yes, we can do this. So let's plunge in. Let's go forward. All right, let's go get it done. So I'm so pleased to be able to moderate this session today. I want to introduce our speakers who are the real stars of the book that Nicol has published. So let me just go down the line here. First, Dr. Kathy Trimble, to my immediate left, is a native of Marion, Alabama. She began as a substitute teacher and then remained committed to her school until eventually she became principal of the school. Under her leadership, this formerly underperforming school, which was consistently on the failing school list, not only came off the failing school list, but eventually the school received one of Alabama's banner awards. Teach for America gave her an Administrator of the Year award because of her transformative leadership. She took the big step of retiring, and that lasted 1 month. She then took a job as principal at Banks Academy, a private school in Birmingham, Alabama. And in 3 years, the school's enrollment has increased by over 100% and is one of the fastest growing schools in Birmingham. So amazing success for you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tom.
Barry Tozer, to her left, is currently the founder and president of TNT Advisory Group, where he offers consulting services to foster growth in both nascent and established companies. Before founding TNT, Barry co-founded and led Declaration Networks Group, a broadband services provider using wireless and TV white spaces spectrum to bring affordable internet to rural markets. He has also served as president and CEO of Mobilians, did I pronounce that right, Mobilians, an early-stage mobile payments venture, and also co-founded The Hub, a prominent networking group for telecom professionals in Washington, D.C. So welcome, Barry. Thanks for joining us. And then we have Christopher Wood. Christopher is a renowned entrepreneur and advocate for the LGBTQ plus community. He has founded 3, not 1, but 2, but 3 LGBTQ plus focused nonprofit organizations, a B2B company, a B2C company. Not sure what B2C means, but maybe you can explain that for us. And has been a prominent voice in over 100 events. As the executive director and co-founder of the LGBT Tech and COO of Redwood and Company, he has collaborated with major tech firms and government agencies. Christopher's ventures also include the Shenandoah LGBTQ Center, addressing service gaps in Virginia. He joined Vice President Harris for the launch of the ACP Affordable Connectivity Program at the White House in 2022. Chris, we're very pleased to have you on board here with this panel.
Thank you for having me.
So with that, let me start with Dr. Trimble. Kathy, you've implemented a one-to-one program at your school, and maybe at both of your schools. I don't know, you can tell us more. But I think what's using iPads, I believe.
Absolutely.
And I think what I was struck by the comment in Nicol's book is that you found that the use of the technology, and actually getting to your question a few minutes ago, that technology did not necessarily improve students' test scores, but the technology did improve the students' motivation and engagement. So I think that's a really important concept for the future thinking of how we use this technology. Can you say more about that?
Sure. You would think, and probably a lot of people think, once you put something bright and shiny in someone's hands, all the magic is going to happen. That doesn't work. Putting a car in someone's garage doesn't mean I can drive it. So the first thing they have to do is learn how to utilize the material or the device properly and with etiquette. So the first thing that we had to do was to make sure they learn how to use it. So now they got this brand new shiny device, and of course the first thing they want to do is find out how it works, playing as much as they can, enjoying it as much as they can. But then there's also the academic or educational element that goes along with it. But we couldn't start with the children. We had to start with the adults. And the other thing that we have to understand, just as in rural America or in the positions that we're in, just as our children did not know how to adequately use these devices, our teachers in the schools, unfortunately, did not know how to use these devices. So the first thing we had to do was provide some professional development for them. And then once that happened, and I can remember one of the first PDs that happened when they turned the computers on, turned the iPads on, they talked about all the places that you will go. And they showed the Statue of Liberty in New York City. They showed Disney World. They showed all of these places. So, of course, our children are enamored with those things as well as our people. So what was happening is they were looking at all of the places that they could go. But we had to provide them with the tools to get there. So that was our responsibility. So that is what we did. And initially, no, it did not change the test scores, but it improved the enthusiasm for school. It improved the motivation for our teachers. I can remember having conversations with our teachers to say, hey, now you have to do your lesson plans online. They had to engage our students in the educational setting with these devices, and the teachers were looking at me like, are you crazy? Yes, I am crazy. That's why I'm asking this. That's why I have these expectations. But once we got that rolling, I can remember, and this was quoted in the book, I still remember a child saying that they did not know that they could do the things that they could do without these tools and learning how to utilize them. So now, no, we were on the failing school list, but that was just the beginning. I might add, since then, we have been off, that school has been off the failing school list continuously and has not gone back. So the tools, the devices, the education, the professional development, the planning, them knowing all the places that they can go and them seeing that has brought them to, when I left that school for my 1 month of retirement, I might add, 100% of our scholars graduating from high school. But not only that, 100% of them attending college. Why? Because they could see where they could go. They could see jobs that they could actually be involved in or be employed in. So it helped to make all of the difference in the world. The tools don't make a difference. What we do with the tools is what makes the difference.
That's well said, well put. And I want to ask you a follow-up question right away. Did you have to educate students not just about the technology, but sort of the good uses of the technology and the, shall we say, non-educational uses of the technology?
Digital citizenship was top on our list. That was very, very important because as Nicole pointed out, a lot of them had cell phones. So there were things that they were doing on their cell phones that they wanted to do with these devices. We had to make sure they understand the purpose for the devices, why they were there, and how they could be utilized. Yes, you can have the fun with your phones, but then so much more that you can learn with these tools. And once we got that, along with, as I said before, the digital citizenship, it helped and it mattered.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Very good. Well, let's move on. Barry, with your experience with Declaration Networks, to bring wireless service to Western Maryland, to Garrett County, that Nicole talked about was I think it was a real eye-opener for you, Nicole, to see this wireless broadband technology at work. But we know that broadband service in the rural areas can be expensive, and the low density of populations can make the economics a little bit difficult. So can you tell us about the real-world experience that you had with Declaration Networks and serving Garrett County, Maryland? And was that a model that can be used around the rest of the country or in other rural markets?
I think it can, but it was a real challenge, and it still is. Our company, Declaration Networks Group, headquartered in Vienna, Virginia, where people in the audience here today, and myself living in Fairfax County, we can get all the broadband we can eat. This is not true in Garrett County. I don't know how many of you have been to Garrett County. It's only 3 hours west of here, but it might as well be in another world when it comes to broadband. So when Declaration Networks Group embarked upon building a network out in Western Maryland, the most western county in the state of Maryland, a very tough terrain, mountainous area, and as John mentioned, low density, it was very, very difficult. We started that project back in 2016, and it was a vast wasteland, a desert, with very few people, having broadband, good connections out there. So what we were trying to do, and there was certainly a cost. We did have some grant money to help us, but very expensive to build out, in that kind of a market. And what Nicole profiled in the book, I think really was a microcosm of what it's like to be out there, what it was like to be out there for broadband back, 8, 9 years ago. I took Nicole to 4 different places to just see what it's like to be in that county. And the first place we went was to a large family farm, a Mennonite family, the Yoder family. It's had a farm for decades. But in today's world of farming, with precision agriculture and even just doing basic tasks with trying to, look up parts and supplies and do things that are very common for the rest of us to do. Very difficult to do if you don't have a good broadband connection. So we were able to connect the Yoder farm and give them broadband. That was number one. Number two, we went to a tire and auto mechanic shop called Mayo Tire. Again, basic stuff like trying to order tires, look up parts, look up supplies, just do the basics that you need to do to run a business and, have, connectivity for employees and just all the process work that a business needs to do. I mean, think about trying to do that without a good broadband connection. I know it's hard for us to imagine that, but that's a typical business back years ago in Garrett County. So fortunately, we were able to connect them. The story that I maybe even like the best was the one out at the Swan Meadow School, which is a 3-room schoolhouse. 3 rooms, about 90 students. 3/4 of them are either Amish or Mennonite. And these kids, need to learn and need to do what, all of our kids and all of our friends' children do in school with having the ability to have a broadband connection. And of course, Dr. Trimble knows all about this all too well. And they were just unable to do a lot of things because they didn't have broadband. But after we connected them, we were so happy to hear them report that this little school won a robotics contest. And they advanced to the international level, and they cited the fact that they were able to do a lot of research and a lot of work that was necessary as part of that contest and competition because they had a good broadband connection. And finally, we went to the Garrett Community Action Center, which is designed to help a lot of the residents of the community and a lot of disadvantaged people living out there. They, too, need to provide service to people. So many people. We had one person that we met, who just was unable to get proper health care, needed to have telehealth capability, which has, of course, become even more prominent, during the pandemic and now since the pandemic. But think about this beforehand, having to go, to Morgantown, West Virginia to get to a good hospital and not being able to do a televisit, in between. But we were able to connect them as well. So we weren't able and haven't been able to connect everybody out there, but enough people to kind of bridge the divide, somewhat and get into a position now, where things are in much better shape when it comes to broadband in that county.
That's great to hear. Now, actually, I had a chance to visit Garrett County myself about 5 or 6 years ago, and I remember that the school, maybe not the school you're referring to, but a different school, had to have 2 different antennas on the school, depending on which spectrum band they were using. So one spectrum band could go only go line of sight. Yeah. So that worked if there were no trees in the way, but if there were trees in the area, which there were a lot of trees out in that area, they had to use a different spectrum band. So that makes things a lot more complicated. Is that a sustainable model to have to use different types of spectrum to accommodate different geographic needs?
Not really in today's environment, and fortunately things are changing for the better. I mean, we were one of the pioneering companies with TV Whitespace, and TV Whitespace is a technology for unused broadcast channel spectrum that can be repurposed and used for internet connectivity along with some other uses as well. And besides that, just standard fixed wireless technology does typically involve line of sight, that if you can't connect these 2 points through, physical line of sight, you may not have a good connection. Fortunately, we knew in the beginning that if we could put fiber into everyone's home, we would have done it, but it's very expensive. Now that there are programs like the BEAD program and other programs in the state of Maryland where some financial resources are available to build out fiber, the rules of engagement have changed. But, John is not far off, though, that there still are certain configurations there where you try to use, and that's how we always looked at it at Declaration Networks, whatever technology we could use, whatever would work. If we needed to bounce a signal off and do a hub or a relay to get a connection to someone's house, we connected tons of people through bouncing a signal from one location to another location just to get a connection into someone's home because that line of sight was not there. So it's a little bit of a tricky business. I think things are moving forward now, but it's going to take more time. But we'll come back and do another program like this down the road. We'll be in better shape. More people will have fiber, which is the gold standard. And then, people in these rural markets will be able to have similar, connectivity and speeds to what people do in urban areas.
Very well put. Thank you. Sure. So turning to Chris Wood now. Chris, I was fascinated by the discussion in Nicol's book about your experience in Staunton, Virginia. From the LGBTQ perspective, a lot of rural areas are pretty isolated, and I think you have a positive story to say about how valuable the internet is for people of different origins, backgrounds, different characteristics, could find a way to communicate with other similarly situated people. So you have a positive story, but I know most of the media right now or lately has been talking about the dangers of this technology and social media and bullying online. But how do you weigh the positives versus the negatives? Is the media over-reporting on some of these troubles? Because you found really some brotherhood with your allies online. So talk to me about your experience.
So it's an interesting point. I'm going to get to that last point because it's a little more complex than just that. But I think it is really important to kind of level set. And before I do that, first and foremost, I'm so proud of you, Nicol, and really happy about this coming out and working with you over the years. So I'm just really excited about this and the work that it potentially and the change it could potentially make. I think it's really important to understand the LGBTQ community in and of itself, recognizing that 7.2% of the population identifies within the LGBTQ community. That's a number. Let me kind of give you a physical idea of what that is. In 2022, we had counted about 5.6%. So more people are either identifying or we are finding ways to count more LGBTQ individuals, or more people are willing to come out and feel secure in that. 11 million of those individuals identify as bisexual, which is larger than the state of the entire population of Georgia. 2.6 identify as lesbian, which is larger than all the farmers in the United States. 3.6 identify as gay, that's larger than the entire population of Utah. 1.6 million identify as trans, that's double the number of police we have, of all police forces in this country. And about the entire population of homeless LGBTQ youth is about the same size as Baltimore, the Baltimore metropolitan area. So the community makes up a huge part, and this is why we really dove into this work. We recognized that the LGBTQ community wasn't being talked about, wasn't being brought to the table in a lot of these spaces, and we started with research. In particular, we recognized that for the National Broadband Plan, LGBTQ individuals were not included. We sat down with Blair Levin and talked to him about that, as well as other writers of the National Broadband Plan, and had conversations about that. And in fact, before LGBT Tech, we were the first organization appointed to the Diversity Committee at the FCC that was really focused on LGBTQ. What we found through our research is that LGBTQ individuals, in fact, adopt technology at double the rate of their heterosexual counterparts. Why? Well, before the internet, the only place for LGBTQ individuals to go to was the major cities, and in particular, the coasts. That's where they went. That's why you saw the enclaves of people in San Francisco and New York. This is why the Stonewall riots really took place in New York. This is why you saw Harvey Milk in San Francisco. It's not just by happenstance. It's because people literally ran to places that they saw, heard little inklings through before the internet came around. Then the internet came around, and we started adopting that technology at a very high rate. We were one of the first communities to really create phone trees where we had these systems going out there around the AIDS epidemic, around making sure our healthcare was taken care of. Like, if you really tie some of these pieces together, you recognize where the community has adopted these technologies and found ways to ensure the safety, protective, and a way of forming community when societally it wasn't accepted. We weren't accepted. And in fact, if you look back at LGBTQ information, there's been disinformation. There's been information erased. I hate to bring it up, but the very first books burned by the Nazis were around the transgender community, where an entire institute that had focused their lifelong work on that community, all those books were burned. And that's just one example. And so we've seen this disinformation, misinformation, deletion of our information. The internet provided a safe space for us to not have that happen. It provided a safe space, and in fact, the reason it provided a safe space was because of Section 230. It provided the sword and the shield for platforms, like social media platforms, to be able to say content was okay or say content wasn't okay, to create safe places, safe spaces for community. You had Planet Out, you had many other websites, you had kind of chat room websites where LGBTQ individuals could finally find community of themselves because they weren't finding it in the communities that they were. I remember dial-up, I remember AOL chat rooms, because it was the only place I could find community, and quite frankly, we're doing that identity exploration on our own well before we're coming out to anybody that we're close to because we don't understand it. And this is true if you're from multiple marginalized communities, because similar to the disability community, the LGBTQ community is one of the only communities that can be across have multiple marginalizations, can be Black and trans or gay and Hispanic or in a multitude of makeups. But the LGBTQ community is one of the only marginalized communities that can be discriminated against in their own biological home. So they don't have the familial support. So therefore they turn to online spaces. They turn to the online spaces to find that community, to find chosen family, to find information, to find resources. And so this is what we found over the 13 years, hard to believe that it's been that long, the 13 years since co-founding LGBT Tech. And what we've really done since the beginning of that, and even talking to Nicol, and it's been a huge inspiration for me in the fact of continuously picking up those rocks and looking in there, going to communities and talking to them. One of our core programs is our Power On program, where we have to date distributed over, I don't have the actual devices, we've connected with about over 360,000 individuals, LGBTQ individuals. We've distributed over $500,000 worth of technology across 141 centers, 40 US states and 2 US territories, as well as 13 other countries around the world. The magic of that is when you put a device in someone's hand, the actual hardware, and then they have the connectivity, whether they're going to McDonald's, Starbucks, they may not have it on their own, or they can just figure out how to get their own connectivity. The magic that happens is incredible, and that's where we have found an incredible pace of people making change in their own community, figuring out how to connect their community, and this drive that Nicol has been on since the beginning, sitting on the first ACDE. I think it's so important to recognize that listening to these individuals and hearing their voice and hearing what they're actually saying is going on the ground is so important, because that's where we make real change. I think I answered your question. I don't want to run through. I could totally pull a Nicol. I've got a ton of notes here, but I don't want to steamroll here. So I think I answered your question.
We're on a roll, though. I'd love to hear more. I mean, yeah. I would just keep going, because the more you talk, the more I'm learning. So if you've got more notes, go ahead.
I do. In that, with the programs we've created, we have our Power On program that distributes technology. We have our PAS program, which drives LGBTQ individuals into STEAM. You're talking about representation. You're talking about seeing their future. That's exactly what we created with the PAS program, is the fact that people couldn't see themselves. And so we're using the internet, we're using YouTube to go ahead and have LGBTQ individuals that are in STEAM fields tell their story about how they got there, recognizing that getting into those fields is not a linear path, unless you're a doctor, in one of those fields. But a lot of IT positions, a lot of web development positions, a lot of AI positions are not a linear path. And so we've created programs around that to make sure that we're really using the power of the internet, using the power of community, and using the power of some of the government projects that are happening, well, even if they disappear. As I tell my digital navigator, I'm like, yeah, well, the government just unplugged that for a moment, so just hold on to it and maybe we'll be back. The other thing is really in particular to rural. I kind of talked about the fact that people were moving to the coast as LGBTQ. The Movement Advancement Project actually found that LGBTQ individuals, are staying in their area more. But the thing that they did realize was that economically, they're worse off than their heterosexual counterparts. It's harder for them to find jobs. It's harder for them to find employment that's actually safe. And it's important to recognize that even this year alone, and we're not even through the entire year, there have been over 500 anti-LGBTQ bills that have either been entered into state legislatures or have passed, which is creating an awful state for our community. And the other thing, if you go to lgbttech.org/research, you'll see a report that's called Left Out, Logged Off, or Logged Off, Left Out. That actually looks at the overlay of anti-LGBTQ bills across the country, as well as the laws that are trying to govern our internet, COSA, age-appropriate design code, all of these pieces. And the thing that you're going to see is that just because they don't have LGBTQ in the bill doesn't mean they're not going after our marginalized communities. They are. They are going after our marginalized communities in these state bills. They're making it harder for us to gain access to information, even though it's harder for us to get access to the internet. It's harder for us to get access in some of these places. But then they're trying to over-legislate some of our, once we have access to some of these platforms, which is creating a detriment for so many communities, especially those that come from multiple marginalizations. I think I'll stop there and let it turn over.
All right, very, very, very good, very helpful. I want to pick up on a couple of the key words in the title of Nicol's book, which she already talked about, making people visible and not being invisible anymore, but allowing this technology to give them a voice. Each of you sort of represents different types of marginalized communities who have been ignored or not given their fair share. But there is also a theme in the book, and some of the interviews, Nicol, that you mentioned from some of the real-life people that you talked to said, I'm not sure I want to be on that internet because I've got some privacy concerns. And so what is the balance? Can you each speak to how much more visible do you want to be, but also what kind of protections do you need to see in the technology that will allow people to retain their independence and their freedom? So a certain amount of privacy is going to actually help them feel more comfortable using the technology. So I don't know if you would like to start, Kathy, to address the visible nature of the students and the teachers.
I just want to address just the title of the book, if I can. Okay. Sure. Nicol, you've done a wonderful job. Okay, wonderful job. And the title of the book is Digitally Invisible. And I heard you say that you had to change something in the book 3 times based on legislation. It is sad that you could not take the title of this book and just slash through it and say, wow, this is what we were dealing with. It is sad to say that we are still dealing with this. Yeah. We're saying digitally invisible. We're not saying electrically invisible. We're not saying indoor plumbing invisible. We're saying digitally invisible in the 21st century, in 2024, which makes absolutely no sense whatsoever. There is no one that should be invisible. And I think the laws and everything that comes along with the privacy part, just like I talked about from the very beginning from us as a school, although we did not start on the top, we're still on the top. We're riding there. And I think the same thing could happen in terms of privacy once we get all of this other stuff taken care of. But I think our policymakers and our politicians have to get out of themselves and realize there are other people out there, and we are real. Our students are real. Our people are real. Our homes are real. And then we could talk about all of this other privacy stuff.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Gotcha. Well said. Barry, how would you respond?
Not sure I can follow up so eloquently on that. And of course, Dr. Trimble lives in a rural community, and I do not. You know, I was with a company that has rural markets that we were selling into and deploying networks. But my sense, and tell me whether this is true or not. My sense, in certain ways, people in these communities, people that live in rural America, want to be a little bit less visible than some people that live in urban areas, but not when it comes to digital.
Absolutely.
People live in these communities for certain reasons, by choice. And they don't want to be living in the crazy, hectic, fast pace that we have here in the DMV. They've chosen not to live, in this type of an area. But when it comes to, being part of society, being part of digital society, they do not want to be invisible. They want to be able to do the same things that people do elsewhere. And that's, I've had so many conversations with people, and our company was not just in Garrett County, but Eastern Shore of Virginia, in West Virginia, several other markets, around the country, and the same information has been shared with me by people in all of these markets that, that the feeling of being left behind and the feeling of being shut out and trying. I mean, there's one guy that we had talked to on the Eastern Shore of Virginia that, and I won't try to ding, I'll say it's a big provider that many of you probably use, but for 10 years, he tried to get that provider to help to, get some type of connection to where he lived on a place called Smith Beach on the Eastern Shore of Virginia. Got nowhere, absolutely nowhere. For 10 years. And, we aren't the greatest company of all time, but we came in and went into that community and connected that community. And it was as if, a rainbow, was over the community where somebody actually listened, and that he wasn't going to be invisible anymore, that he could be, visible. And that's all people are looking for, somebody to listen to them, somebody to try to, get them connected. But what's the big reason why people aren't connected? It's all about the money. This costs a lot of money. So, and that's some of my thoughts on this, John.
Yeah, very good. Very good. And Chris, how would you respond to that question about privacy versus visibility?
I'm going to go on a quick story, a very quick. At LGBT Tech, I have a strong belief, and my team knows this, is that if we are talking about something like XR or AI, if we're talking about the way that it's impacting the community, we're building in it. We're building projects, we're working in it. We will not talk about anything publicly unless we are actively in it. My entire team has XR headsets. We actively learn about AI and building in it. We have projects in it. Why do I bring that up? Because I think legislators across the country, I've watched so much legislation be passed around the internet, around community, around privacy, around what people should have access to and shouldn't have access to, but yet they don't understand the communities that their legislation impacts. The Black communities, the African, the Hispanic communities, the Asian Pacific Islander communities, the immigrant communities, the LGBTQ communities, disabilities communities. They're not necessarily reaching out into those areas and making sure that they fully understand, not just across the country, but in their community, how it's impacting them. On top of that, how the technology works. And then we have those legislators moving out of the states and moving into a federal level where they have to even understand even more. And the number of times that I've had conversation with legislators who are significantly older, the age of Congress is quite old, and to be legislating on some of this stuff and limiting it and hindering it, I think continues to be a problem. So if I'm going to go at the root of the issue around privacy and making sure that our communities are impacted, heard, is we need to have younger people from diverse communities running for these positions and winning in these positions to make sure that the voices that need to be heard are heard, that the experiences, the lived experiences of these individuals is heard and included, and that the right people are brought to the table when we're talking about making policies for the people that we're trying to help and serve. I think that's really the core of the problem, because I could say we need better policy, we need a federal privacy protection, but quite frankly, I don't want this current Congress tackling that issue, because the representation is not there. The representation is not there in a lot of the states, and I think it's a major problem that we need to look at as a country.
So I have one more question I'm going to try to ask for somewhat quick responses, because I would like to give the audience a chance to ask a question in just 1 minute. But picking up off of Nicol's comment about maybe the New Deal is not the greatest model for us to be looking forward and how to solve this digital divide problem. I know from my perspective, I've always had a little bit of uncomfortable or discomfort when people say, well, we should just treat broadband as a utility, as if that's going to solve the problem. And I think that masks that broadband is a much more multidimensional problem to solve, because you've got the computers, you've got the internet connection, you've got the training, you've got wireless and wired. So I just wonder, what is the right approach? Is there a good model? If New Deal is not the right model, what is the best way that you would recommend that legislators try to tackle and solve this digital divide? I mean, obviously, we've got the BEAD funds and the Capital Projects Fund, another, 42 plus 10, somewhere around $65 billion that has been already appropriated. Is that going in the right direction, or is there more that the government should do?
I think, to Chris's point, I think representation matters. And it's hard to understand a lack when you've never had one. It's hard to understand. I always say this as an educator. I can't teach a boy how to be a man. I need a man to do that, okay, because I've never been one. So it's hard for someone to understand the positions that we're in, or the positions of these rural children and people are in. And it's hard for them to really grasp their minds around it when they're sitting at the table and making these policies and making these decisions. So thus, going back, and I hate to keep pounding it, thus the term invisible. If it's not out of sight, out of mind. So I do think representation matters. I do think that.
Nothing for us without us.
Absolutely.
Right. Yes.
Absolutely.
Very good. Barry.
And again, I come from this from the corporate side, which is different than my two colleagues here. And I don't want to make it sound so simple that it's just a dollars and cents issue, because it's much, much more complex than that. But the money is at the root of this. We could have built out more networks in more places if we had more funding. We received grants and went through grant programs and loan programs, and then so many, different, national and state, funding type of programs, and there are more now, like BEAD, and these are all very good vehicles, but they're slow. They're bureaucratic, a lot of red tape. They get to be political, and the ball moves too slowly. Everything is just, there are now better intentions. The intentions and the intent, 8 to 10 years ago wasn't like it is today. There's more and better intent now, but it's about results. It's not a world of intentions, it's a world of results, and trying to get, some of this money out, to the companies that can build these networks, to the communities that need these networks. I mean, to me, that it's the need for speed. People are looking for, high speed, but it's get the speed to get the funding to get the speed of the internet that people are looking for.
Yeah, I don't think utility is the answer. As someone who has sat on I've been appointed to several committees, and as you alluded to in the beginning of this conversation, I'm an entrepreneur, so I like to think outside the box. Nothing drives me crazier than sitting on a bureaucratic board where I can't do what I need to do to get the answers that I need to get the answers to help the people that I want to help, or even sometimes survey them. So Nicole knows my rants. I go on them a lot. But I think, I do think about the power of our young people and industry, I think is really kind of what brings it to mind for me. We have a great relationship with Penn State and Nittany AI and Global Silicon Valley and Penn State. And the ideas that come out of these young people through their lived experiences is so important and so powerful for the next generations of what's being developed, because it is their lived experience, whether they're first generation, or whether maybe they're the first generation to go to college, maybe they're the first generation to complete high school. Like these things matter, and those stories matter, because it's those individuals. And I think it's important to recognize, I know my privilege. I am a white, middle-class guy. I am gay, but I wasn't for the first 19 years of my life, or I wasn't out. But you know, I think it's important to recognize is like I'm bringing this from stories of other people, those 360,000 individuals that we've been connected with across the country in one program. It's those stories that I carry around with me all the time, and hearing those voices, and where we try to give them platform and space to speak, because it's their stories that are going to make the difference, and it's their opportunities. When you create opportunity for them, when it's not a utility, but we're actually then encouraging those individuals to diversely go into industry and take their ideas into practice, that's where we see real change. So I don't have an exact answer for you, but utility is not it.
Is not the answer, right. We have time for just one question. I'm sorry, I think we've got one right here.
I'm sorry you're up against the time. I'm really glad to hear about you reaching out or mentioning the disability community, because the one area where it probably needs the most connectivity is within the government's grasp. The government provides housing and care for them. The institutionalized community, that's nursing homes, mental hospitals, and people in the legal system, they're the last to be connected. Personal experience having to do with Stanton. One of my family members ended up in Western State Hospital, one of our 20 Virginia state hospitals, just when COVID hit. So we drive down there, like 2-hour drive, a couple times a week, see him in person. You could also talk on the phone, but when once COVID hit, you couldn't visit in person, and you couldn't talk on the phone when the person can't come to the phone because they have a drug reaction that they're paralyzed. So I went to the administrator and said, why don't you do Zoom? Everybody else is doing Zoom. Oh, finally convinced her. It took a year to do that. Took a year to do another hospital. So I finally went to the legislature, and they passed a bill where it's mandated for all the 10 hospitals. And they actually found that it helped them because they were short of staff in the third year of COVID. And all the low-income people there, they can't visit. And they were moving these people all around the state because of the staff shortage. Anyhow, go on and on. But institutionally, these people they're lonely. They lack mental capacity. Old people in nursing homes, mentally ill people, old people at home. They need to be connected. Thanks.
Very good
I know
point.
it wasn't a question, but I do want to. I want to respond to. No, I really want to say is that it's really important. And the thing is, we shouldn't have to wait 2 and 3 years to have legislature pass it. For LGBT Tech, we went across the country with centers because with Zoom, initially you had to have HIPAA compliant Zoom in order to have some of these, and you had to have 10 licenses, which is unrealistic for some nonprofits. It's expensive. So what we did was break them up. So that's what I'm talking about, is like we need to be breaking down systems, breaking down barriers where we can as nonprofits and stuff. So I'm just sorry you had to go through that, but also we should all in this room be looking at ways to break down barriers.
Well, very good. Unfortunately, this is all the time we have, but people will be here for your individual questions afterwards. But please thank the panelists for the great job. Very informative.
So as we get ready to wrap up, these are the people that I met. And many more. And I want to thank you all for your time and just put me on your schedules to be able to spend time with you. They're not just people that I talk to for the book, but they've become lifelong friends. So I urge you to follow their work and to pay attention to what they're doing. So now you have a sense of what the book is like, right? I just again want to say thank you to everybody who has been part of this movement. I want to say hello to Carmen. She brought 8 students from George Washington University, of which, stand up, of which I personally bought and donated books to them, because the other part of this book journey is that we need more people like you all to do this work. We're getting up there, and we need the next generation to lead us. So thank you for bringing the students. And for any student listening, this is a book, again, that I wrote not just for policy wonks like ourselves, but for people who are just everyday people trying to figure this out. Friends, I just want to end with this. I'm trying not to cry because this was a really emotional journey for me. This issue is one that's not new. This issue is one that should not be sort of resigned to its own space with somebody trying to figure it out. This issue is actually all about us. And so I hope today, and just hearing from my dear friends here, for those of you who started the book, for those of you who are going to get the book, I'll be signing some at the end, that you realize that this is just not an issue that should sit on the sidelines or be adjacent to every issue we have in our country. This is our country. And if we can do this right, you know, we do have challenges, policy challenges in particular. We have challenges in terms of community. We have challenges in terms of psychological overuse. But we have to address this issue because there's so many people who are not like us. As our dear friend says, they're not like us. They're not like us. And we have to really address this issue that it's not to make them like us, as you see with the diversity here, but it's to make sure that they can at least partake in the same things that we do. So with that, thank you again. I'll be in the back signing books. I appreciate all of you. Thank you. I love you. And follow our work at Brookings. I do have a day job. When I'm not doing this, we do have the Center for Technology Innovation where we have our podcast and our newsletter, and we're constantly taking on and challenging these issues. So thank you. Thank you.